One thing I've learned about God is that sometimes He will let you keep doing things your way until you finally realize your way is not taking you where you want to go. Not because He's trying to punish you, but because some lessons don't fully sink in until you've lived them long enough to feel the weight of them. And I know that personally. Before I surrendered my dating life to God, I dated like the world. I dated multiple men, at a time, trying to figure out who felt the best fit, who felt like the best fit, going out to clubs, spending time in each other's homes, crossing boundaries, having sex, doing what felt normal, what felt familiar, what everybody around me seemed to be doing. And, for a while, I thought that's just how dating worked. You meet someone, you see where it goes, and if it doesn't work, move on, try again. But over time, I started noticing something, and no matter who it was, the outcome felt the same. The connection might look different, the personality might be different, but what it produced in me wasn't. Confusion, emotional attachment, disappointment, and eventually heartbreak. And after living that way long enough, I had to be honest with myself. This was not leading me to what I wanted most, because what I desired most was marriage, not just companionship, not temporary connection, marriage. And I started realizing something hard. The way I was dating could never produce the kind of marriage I was praying for. And that realization changed everything because it made me ask myself, how could I keep asking God for one thing while living in a way that keeps producing another? It wasn't adding up, okay? So that's when I surrendered, not because I had everything figured out, but because I knew my way was no longer working. It was never working. And what I've learned since then is this. Like God will often allow patterns to continue long enough for you to recognize what you are producing or what those patterns are producing. So there's a scripture in Proverbs 14 and 12 that says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And I think that, I don't know if that always means physical death. Sometimes it means the death of peace, the death of clarity, of time, of potential, because your own way can keep you stuck longer than you realize. And eventually, if you're willing to pay attention, God will use that exhaustion to invite you into something better. Not easier, but better. And maybe that's where you are right now. You've been doing things your way and you're starting to feel the weight of it. And if that's you, this conversation might be right on time. And, one thing I've learned also is that patterns reveal what we often try not to look at. They expose the choices that we keep making, what we keep tolerating, and where we may still be stuck. A lot of us, we pray for change, but we don't always stop to examine what our current decisions are producing. Okay, so Galatians 6 and 7, it says that do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. And while we often hear that in the context of sin, it applies to life as a whole. It applies to the patterns that we repeat and the outcomes tied to them. Because if the seed remains the same, the harvest usually does too. This is where many people get stuck, not because they don't love God or lack faith, but because they haven't recognized the cycles they're in. And, I think about a woman who keeps, finding herself with emotionally unavailable men. At first, each relationship feels promising. They always do, right? There's chemistry, attention, and then enough connection to keep her hopeful. But over time, the same signs show up: distance, inconsistency, emotional uncertainty. And even though, the faces change, the experiences feel familiar. Eventually, she realizes that it isn't just choosing different men, she's repeating the same emotional pattern. And that's how cycles work. They often feel normal until you step back and notice that what they keep producing. And I want to say that you have to take the time to step back. And in this case, not get distracted by jumping into the next relationship. You got to give yourself some time to reflect. And so the same can happen with money. Someone wants financial peace, a home, or the ability to move their family to a better neighborhood, but avoids the discipline, the planning, or the changes that are required to get there. I know that personally. So for years, my credit was bad, and it quietly affected how I saw my future. So owning a home felt far away. And even getting another car, that felt difficult. And I had to face the reality that wanting something wasn't enough. You can't just want your way into something. Can't just hope your way and even pray, and yet there's action required. So, my habits had to change. And that meant, taking action, getting a new job, and making decisions that supported the future that I said I wanted. And that's what cycles can do when you pay attention. They force honesty. And, there's a moment in Deuteronomy 2 and 3 where God tells the Israelites that you have circled this mountain long enough. That verse always stands out to me. I've used it a few times because it reminds me that, like some seasons stretch out because there's still something that we need to see, that we need to confront or surrender before we can move forward. And if you're willing to pay attention, what keeps repeating in your life may be revealing exactly where the change needs to begin. So one thing I've noticed about God as well is that, sometimes he will let you see in other people the very things that you're praying for. And it's not to make you jealous for you to feel behind, but to show you what's possible, to show you what exists when something is built the right way. And that might look like seeing a marriage that is peaceful, stable, and centered on God. Not perfect, but healthy. A husband and wife who genuinely respect each other. Children who are secure, wise, and thriving. Or maybe it's someone who has the house you want, the financial stability you want, the discipline you want, right? The healthy body that you've been trying to build, or the courage to walk in purpose while you're still sitting on yours. And if we're not careful, those moments can stir comparison, but I've learned that they can also reveal something deeper. Sometimes what you admire in someone else is showing you what your heart truly wants. And it may also expose where your current choices are not leading you there. And there's a powerful example of this in Numbers chapter 13. So before Israel entered the promised land, God allowed them to see it first. And what they saw was exactly what he promised: fruit, abundance, provision. It was real. The life God spoke about existed. But even after seeing it, most of them still couldn't enter. Not because God changed his mind, but because fear kept them right where they were. And that story, it says so much, because sometimes God will let you see the promise before you're prepared to walk in it. Right? Some of you might have dreams or visions yourself. Some of you may have been prophesied to. And that's all of that. It's not to frustrate you, but to reveal what still needs to change. That's happened in my own life. I remember seeing marriages that I deeply respected, but I was still dating my own way. And I knew deep down that, what they had was what I wanted. Not just a wedding, not just companionship, but peace, stability, a God-centered foundation. And as much as I admired it, I also had to be very honest that, the way that I was living at the time could never produce that kind of marriage. And that realization was uncomfortable. Some of you might have to sit with that. You want the 6 foot plus guy, 6 figure, maybe a million at this point. Drives a nice car, owns his own home. Y'all want all of that, okay? Ain't got no debt. Right, so you might be circling the same cycle, and you need to get that realization that might be uncomfortable. And maybe that's not what God has for you. I'm not saying it's not, but if you're finding yourself in repeated cycles, and sometimes you might need to check what those desires are. Like, do they align with what God has for you? Okay, so the realization, though, it was necessary because sometimes God uses, what we can see to help us confront what our choices are producing. And it's not about, coveting what someone else has. It's about asking yourself, what would have to change in me to walk into what I say I want? And there's wisdom in that. And that's why Proverbs 13 and 20 says, walk with the wise and become wise. Who you observe matters, what you admire matters, because God can use those examples to pull you toward growth, to show you there's another way, a better way. And sometimes seeing what's possible is the very thing that helps you stop, settling for what's familiar. And I've learned that exhaustion can be one of God's greatest tools for getting our attention. Not because, he causes every hard thing in our lives, but because he will often let us fully experience where our choices are leading us. All right, that hurts. Like, yep, go ahead and do it. Let you burn yourself so you don't touch that pot again, right? So there comes a point where you can no longer ignore what a pattern is costing you. And that's where I found myself in dating. So after years of moving the way that I'd always known how, like following chemistry and connection, attraction, and all of that, and emotion, I eventually saw the pattern clearly. And what started as excitement, it often ended in confusion. And what felt promising and often lacked the foundation. And what I kept hoping for would not, would turn into commitment. And over time, I started recognizing that I wasn't just disappointed by people, but I was disappointed by the outcomes that my own choices like kept creating for me. And that kind of realization, it changes you. So I'm thankful for it. Because eventually, you stop asking, why does this keep happening? And you start asking, like, what am I doing that keeps leading me here? And that question changed everything for me. It brought me to a place of surrender. I finally accepted that, my way wasn't producing the life I wanted. And surrender often starts there, right there, at the point where you've exhausted all your own methods. And there's a powerful example of this in the story of Jonah. So Jonah in the Bible, he had clear direction from God, but he chose another route. What stands out to me about this story is how, heavy everything became once he started running. And the storm intensified, for example, the fear spread, chaos followed, and eventually he found himself in complete darkness inside the belly of a fish. And that's what clarity met him, though. And that's where he finally turned back toward God. And I think, the story, it resonates because, many of us know what it feels like to keep resisting what we know that God has been showing us. And sometimes it's staying in the patterns that we've outgrown, holding on to relationships that keep draining us, avoiding, changing or avoiding the changes that we know we need to make. Remaining in those environments that they feel safe, but keep us stagnant. And over time, the effort it takes to maintain those things, it becomes heavier than releasing them itself. And that's often, when surrender becomes possible, because surrender, it usually doesn't begin when life feels comfortable. It's when, the truth becomes really unavoidable. You can't avoid it anymore. It's in your face. All right. If you have a brain and something keeps happening, you keep doing things the same way, eventually you're going to wake up. If you have a brain, I'm sorry, I'm getting harsh. But what I love about God is that, when you come to him in that place, he doesn't meet you with shame when you finally surrender, right? So he meets you with direction, grace, and mercy. Psalms 37:23 says that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. So sometimes the next right step, it begins with admitting that, I can't keep doing this the same way. In that moment, more than anything, is often where the real change begins. And one thing that I had to learn is that, surrender doesn't always lead to immediate results. Sometimes it leads to waiting, a lot of times. And that could be confusing because, once you've made the hard decision to do things God's way, like part of you expects movement. You expect things to open up, and clarity. You expect progress. But often, unfortunately, what comes next, not unfortunately, but it feels like in the moment, what comes next is, a season where like nothing is changing. And that was true for me. So, after I surrendered my dating life to God and, committed to honoring him, in the area of like waiting until marriage for sex, I still waited. Marriage didn't come right away. God wasn't like, oh, yes, she made the decision. Marriage is falling down. No, it did not work that way. Okay, so the desire, it was still there. The prayer was still there. But so was a time in between the promise and the fulfillment. And, looking back now, I understand why. God was using that time to prepare me, not just for marriage either, but for the kind of marriage I've been praying for. There were, things in me that needed strengthening. My discernment, it became sharper. My standards, I had developed some. I became clearer on those. My patience deepened. I learned how to sit with loneliness without, letting it make decisions for me. I learned how to recognize peace instead of chasing excitement. That's going to be temporary, right? And all that mattered because, the woman I became in the waiting season was different than the woman who, first prayed those prayers. And honestly, there were some, specific belief shifts that God had to work in me during that time. Things I didn't even realize, were shaping, how I viewed myself and how I approached the future. And, I go a lot deeper in those belief shifts in my webinar because they were a huge part of preparing me for the marriage that I have now. And, if that's something that you're walking through, then I'll link the webinar below. It is free. So that's what waiting often does, though. It develops you. In John 15:2, it is where, Jesus talks about pruning. Pruning is uncomfortable because it involves, cutting, removing, reshaping. But the purpose is growth. And I think that's what many of us miss. Waiting is not empty space. It's often where pruning happens, where God removes what no longer serves you. Old habits, old thinking, old fears, things that cannot go where he is taking you. And I think about David. He was anointed king long before he sat on that throne. And there was a gap between the promise and the position for him. And in that gap, God built him. So leadership, courage, dependence, character, the anointing came first. But the preparation took time. And that is how God often works. And sometimes, the things that the waiting, it feels long because of what you're asking for carries weight. I've talked about this before. Right. So in my case, I wasn't praying for just any husband. I was praying for a man of integrity, a man who feared God, a man who would lead well, love well, and honor his covenant. And that kind of prayer, it carries substance. And it required God to shape both of us. I had to be deserving of that. And it required God to shape both of us. Not into perfect people, but into people prepared for the life we would build together. And I know I reference dating and marriage a lot, but I also know this is the area that many have waited a while in or are currently waiting in. Okay. So with that, that's why I no longer see, waiting the way that I used to. It wasn't wasted time. And some of the things I'm most grateful for in my marriage today were built in me before I even met my husband. And that's what preparation does. It gives you the ability to carry what you once only hoped for. And this principle didn't just show up in my dating life either. It showed up in my finances too. So there was a season where I felt stuck financially. And part of that came from, falling on hard times. I had lost a job and at that time I wasn't making much. So I was living paycheck to paycheck. And like a lot of people do when life gets hard, I leaned on credit cards to stay afloat. I didn't shop or go on vacation. I wasn't living above my means at all. Just trying to survive, trying to keep things together. But, over that time, that season caught up with me. So my credit took a hit and I found myself in a place where moving forward felt difficult. I wanted a better car because it was beat up. I was embarrassed. And, I also wanted the possibility of owning a home. I wanted stability. But those things, they felt far away because the foundation wasn't there yet. And I remember how frustrating that felt. Because when you can see the life that you want, but you're not positioned for it, it forces you to deal with reality. And sometimes that reality is uncomfortable. Proverbs 21:5, it says that the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. That verse became very real to me because I realized that hope wasn't just, going to rebuild what had been damaged. Hope alone couldn't do it. It was going to take consistency, discipline, patience. And then for a long time, I avoided credit cards altogether because I had seen how quickly they could become a burden when life got hard. It may have been over 10 years and I didn't have a credit card. I just saved cash and paid cash for things. So I learned much in that too. I talk about that in some of my webinars if you're really interested. Just kind of like that process, that learning wisdom God gave me through that tough time. But eventually I understood that, avoiding the tool wasn't the answer. It was learning how to use it wisely. That was. So I kept it simple. I opened up a secure credit card. with a small limit, put, a recurring bill on that, paid it off in full every month. And that was my system. It was simple, it was manageable, steady. And then over time, it worked. My credit improved, my options improved, and my confidence improved. And I'll just say this too, like, even though my credit improved, I never bought a new car. I still haven't bought a new car. I just paid cash for my car. I just wanted to throw that out there because it's a lesson. When I talk about like this obedience and exhaustion and how those things can be, in my last video, I talked about obedience and what it does for you, that the reward is more than just the final outcome. It's part of the process. And then here I'm talking about exhaustion and how God can allow you being tired and your exhaustion to realize that the cycles and all of those things that you continue to repeat in your life. But I say this to say that part of the process is the blessing. So even in my lack of credit and not being able to get a car, I learned wisdom. And now that I'm positioned to buy a new car, my experience is like, nope, I don't want a car payment. I apologize for that. A little bit of a rant. But I ended up with 800 credit score, and looking back now, I can see that God was doing more than helping me rebuild my credit. He was teaching me stewardship, and that's the rant that I just went into. Uh, because the blessing often requires the structure to sustain it, and that's why Luke 16:10 says that he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And that applies to money, relationships, purpose, really all of it. So sometimes the thing standing between you and what you desire isn't that God said no. It's that there's still something being built in you first. And for me, financial frustration became another place where God showed me that the cycle could change, but it was going to require me to move differently. And if there's one thing I hope that you take from this, it's that exhaustion is not always a sign that you're failing. Sometimes it's a sign that something is trying to get your attention, a pattern, a mindset, a fear, a place where God may be asking you to trust him differently. And I think that's important because many of us spend so much time asking God to change our circumstances that we don't stop to ask what this season might be trying to teach us. And that's a hard question because it's an honest one. Because sometimes the frustration that you feel is not about what you don't have. It's about recognizing that the way you've been approaching it isn't leading where you want to go. And that realization, it can be a gift if you let it. In James 1:5, it says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And I love that because it reminds us that God is not asking us to figure everything out on our own. He's inviting us to seek him, to ask him for wisdom, to ask him what we need from him, what needs to be shifted, to ask him where we've been resisting, okay, what he may be trying to show us. And maybe for you, this season is not about, striving harder. Maybe it's about becoming more honest, more open, and willing to move differently. Because, change usually does start there. And, also being willing to ask better questions. So, what in my life keeps repeating? What am I avoiding? What have I been doing out of fear? What if I accept it as normal that may no longer fit where God is taking me? Those questions matter because they create room for God to work. There's also a verse in Psalms 32:8 where God says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. That means you don't have to stay stuck. You don't have to keep circling the same places. God is willing to lead you. The question is whether you're ready to follow. And if you're tired, really tired, that may be the very place where surrender comes easier. And sometimes that's exactly where God begins. Okay, I love you, and I'll see you in the next one, Royal Ones.